In this fifth video from War, Art and Visual Culture London, I chair a session with three very interesting artists. The first is Edmond Medici, a former Australian official war artist. The second is David Cotterrell, an artist who is sent to Afghanistan for the Wellcome Institute. The third is Mladen Miljanović, a Bosnian artist who in fact was the first Bosnian artist to show at the Venice Biennale in 2013 after a 20-year hiatus for that country at the Biennale. I hope you enjoy this video. Okay, so for this panel I really I came up with a theme that I want to start the conversation with, but also the other interesting thing about the three practitioners that we have here today is that they all have various degrees of officiality and non-officiality when it comes to producing war art, and this is something that I've found very interesting. Just to go across the stage, we have Edmond Medici, who is, in fact, it's quite funny actually, because I got these guys to send me some bios, and X actually, I thought this was quite funny, said the artist lives in Canberra, Australia, by choice. Canberra's a beautiful place, honestly. But X was sent a few years ago to the Solomon Islands as part of the Australian policing peacekeeping mission there, and I've actually recently read X's diary that is in the archive of the Australian War Memorial, which is fascinating, which I'll ask you a question about actually here. And next along is David Cotterrell, who is an installation artist, an academic and a consultant, and has quite a prolific career with 105 exhibitions of public artworks, and is currently recently has worked with the Sri Lankan playwright and theatre director Ruanthi Dicikera, and they've been working on in a collaboration to develop multidisciplinary interventions within arts, with the visual arts, theatre and policy. And David was also went to Afghanistan with the Wellcome Institute.
Well, they sent me.
They sent it. They didn't go with you. They sent. What year was that? Was it
2007, 2008.
Okay. And our third panelist is Mladen Miljanović, who has flown in from Banja Luka in Bosnia and Herzegovina today. Well, not today, the other day. And Mladen's work. Well, Mladen actually trained as part of his national service, and at the very beginning of his career, and actually then went on to train other sergeants soldiers, in the military, in a particular building that then actually became the Art Academy, the building itself, the Art Academy that you then actually work in. That's right. Yep. And Mladen's also featured in the Venice Biennale. And I suppose what I want to do is the first question I have really, because we will start with these issues to do with temporality, but we'll probably move off this and we'll also take some questions as well. But I wanted to ask David, one of the reasons I'm fascinated in your work is that I'm interested in issues to do with, when I say temporality, I'm specifically, I suppose, interested in how we experience time, how an artist or a soldier in a war zone experiences time, and the ways in which that then is articulated in work. There was a really interesting quote I plucked off a YouTube video from the Theatre of War Symposium in Dublin from 2015, where you talk about the role of your diaries and the photographs, the many photographs that you took, that, you know, when you came back to the UK and produced the work, that there was a kind of a sense of order and narrative that was imposed that, when you look at your diaries, isn't there.
And that, in fact, that there's something, this is really a great part of this quote, where you say, it's so much of the trauma of a situation is actually the ambiguity. It's not clear. It's not the clear understanding of a moment of drama. So the first question I have, which is primarily for you, Deb, but please, anyone feel free to jump in as well, is to what extent does narrative and its teleological tendencies, convey or betray the actual chaos of a war zone?
That's a massive question, but I think this was something which I didn't really understand at the time, but retrospectively you start to understand the protection mechanisms we have for constructing memories, which construct a memory which isn't necessarily representative of the experience you had at the time. And I think one of the things I was wrestling with, I was with a field hospital regiment, so it was a fairly intense experience where I had no utility at all. One of the things I was wrestling with was, what is my purpose as an artist? I didn't want to simply add more representation of the experience for the public domain, because journalists had done a good job of that, but it was trying to think about something which wasn't being articulated, which was resonating with me. And I came to believe that the confusion, not always the fear of what's coming next, but just the uncertainty of what's coming next was a really powerful, resonant experience, and something that burns deeply into you. It can be it causes a sense of claustrophobia, but also absolute lack of agency. And the problem is that subsequent to the event, you know what's happened. You understand the conclusion of that series of random events. You can begin to track back and see some causation between one thing and another, and immediately, when you write your article for the Observer or for the Guardian, as I did, you're able to give a narrative, a story with a beginning, middle, and end, which is much more digestible because we've trained ourselves to understand history that way. But in reality, the history that portrays the experience of a generation before is written not from their perspective, but from ours, from a God's eye view, looking back and understanding how one thing led to another. The hard thing you have is, how do you somehow retain the awareness of the power of confusion, anxiety, chaos, and the sense that things are not necessarily incremental, but they may be random, that maybe the things that you're seeing are not going to be important in terms of any longer narrative, but are purely futile moments of complexity. So, I came to believe that artists maybe have a role in this. We talked a lot about the problems with art, but I think there is something extraordinary which artists can do, which they can actually challenge the frame and the format for the way in which we try and deliver our ideas, as well as trying to fit our ideas into an existing format. Within a news bulletin, Channel 4 News, you might possibly get as much as 3 minutes to describe something. With a historical treatise, you've got a certain way in which you have to claim objectivity, or at least acknowledge the sources that you're working from. But artists can potentially try and change the frame so that you are dealing with the 12 hours that the person has to see in the gallery, which explains the absolute lack of information you receive, rather than providing a 3-minute YouTube digest of that experience, which kind of explains what that 12 hours was waiting for. For me, I won't speak much longer, but just that the thing which really resonated with me was that my only kind of living understanding of war up until that point, growing up in a suburb, was my granddad, who spent 6 years in bombers to get out of the coal mines. And he didn't speak to his son about the war very much when his son was young, but he did start speaking to me when I was about 11. And he talked about the waiting and the boredom. And everyone talks about this, the 90% boredom and 10% terror, But what I didn't realise was that 90% of boredom might be the thing which is traumatising you as much as the terror. It's not ambiguous lost time. It's the time that eats into people, and where the fear builds, and possibly the fear of their own kind of compromise, and the fact that what they might be doing might be complicit with something terrible, as much as something which can fit within the fabricated noble cause which they've been delivered.
Can you continue that theme, thinking about your experience in the Solomon Islands?
my experience as part of the Australian Artisan War Program, there are only two of us who operated as going to peacekeeping mission. Mostly the others go to war zones. I'm a notorious anti-war creature, so I was quite happy to accept the peacekeeping mission issue. But in terms of where I was sent, there were complexities there, and it was a military and police operation with 15 nations, Pacific nations. Again, if we talk about post-colonial construct, Australia and the Pacific is pure post-colonialism, colonialism and post-colonialism. So, the site was a place, if we're talking about time and memory, a place where atrocious behaviour by the goodies took place, and including the use of gas canisters, which have been consistently denied by the British government, by the Americans as well. They constantly float up from the substrata of the mud in that district, so it's constantly being reworked. So when gas canisters, mustard gas or mustard cyanide, floats up to the surface from the mud, then the British and American governments go into crowd control to deny that they ever used them, even though they say made in England or made in America, and were used by the troops in that country against the Japanese. So, there's a constant remaking of what actually happened in 1940 in the Japanese Pacific War, others woody Pacific War. So it's we find that in Australia there's this persistent viewpoint that they were the bad people and they did bad things, and we were the good people and we did good things. But in my research in the Australian War Memorial Archives, I found atrocious photographs of American soldiers with severed heads of Japanese prisoners. So, if you look at the history of severed heads, colonialism has its fair share of severed heads. So I think the consistent remaking of history never stops. So those narratives are always liquid.
They seem to be retrospectively reconstructed in a case like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Mladen, I saw you writing down some notes.
Yeah, but I don't want to show you.
Okay, I'll ask you the question I prepared for you. This always looks like I'm sending a text in the middle of a session. So you grew up amongst the 1990s Balkan Wars in a society that we've had conversations in the last couple of days that you've described as heavily militarized society, preceding that anyway. And you created a performance work in 2007 called I Serve Art, which I think I actually have an image of, yeah. Okay. In which you actually isolated yourself for 274 days in a former military barracks, which is the place I mentioned earlier. Can you tell me about how this work addresses war and temporality?
First thank you for inviting me, and both Kit and Paul and Uros to be part of this conversation. I need to say it's very interesting. I was just now listening you both of you artists were also commissioned for the Art and War project, and I felt like that I was commissioned by birth, to be born in a very war society in a way. So when I saw the title War, Art and Visual Culture, it's from the society I come from, it comes all in one. And not only now, for my generation, but also for previous generations in a way. So I would just say that, for example, which is very important to come to this point, and I will try to be very short. You have, for example, in each generation of cultural transgression, you have each generation experience at war. And when you look, for example, ethnographic development of the clothes, traditional clothes, for example, like 200 years in the past, 80% of the male clothes is basically military uniform. So just on the basis of that, you can make a conclusion that it's about a society who has this kind of traditional military component, where the war is basically just a consequence of sort of traditional impact into the society reality. And it's I love to tell this, it really explains that. The friend of mine who was my generation, we were together in elementary school in a village where I grew up, wanted to dig out, his father passed away, he wanted to dig out the gun, which his father dig in behind the house after the 90s war in Bosnia. And he was like remembering with the mother, mother was telling, I think it is 5 steps in the direction of the apple tree and then 4 steps in the direction of the garage, you know, and he went to dig out his father's gun, and what he digs out is grandfather gun from the Second World War. So basically it's just telling how this kind of militarism is very deeply rooted. I'm talking this more from this masculinity male perspective, I served the army because I was forced to serve the army. In a way, it's a tradition, and also like there are some very traditional aspects that the families don't want to give a girl if the male didn't serve the army, because he didn't prove that he's a man enough if he didn't serve the army. And coming to conclusion, what actually happened that I didn't avoid that as well. And as I said that I was like commissioned by birth, basically I spent those 5 years from 10 to 15 during the war as a child, and like 1,000 meters from the front line. And after I finished that, I was needed to go to do this national service. I was chosen to be school for reserve officers. 6 months training, I finished that. 3 months training, young soldiers, that was my obligatory service. I went back home and I decided, okay, that's it, nothing anymore with militarism. I go to Art Academy. And I failed at first year on entry exam. Second year, I was accepted. And on third year of my studies, Art Academy space moved into the ex-military base. And I found myself again in a fucking military space. And it was just, you can't rid of that, you know, as much as you are trying to do it. And then on the third year, okay, I was trying consciously to escape this. Yeah, I go to paint abstract expressionism, you know, like do this kind of things, you know, just pushing back in unconscious this kind of aspect of militarism. And then I said, no, I should do completely opposite. I should start from myself to face myself with my personal trauma, you know. First, I consider that I was rejecting this, and whenever it comes about art and war in my society, when you say, I want to do a piece about war, everybody is immediately say, oh, come on, war again, oh, come on, let's do something else. And it's basically telling about collective trauma. The basic first symptom of traumatized person is denial, you know. When you say, no, I don't want to talk about the war, you know, it means that you have some kind of trauma relation to that. And I said, okay, I start from myself, and the first project I did, I will finish now very fast, it was like, okay, I served army 9 months, 274 days. I decided to do a project with a like very important title of it, it's like my statement, I serve art. And basically, project was very simply, I wanted to lock myself 9 months in this very same space, now which became University and Academy of Arts, and to not leave those gates of this ex-military barracks for 274 days for 9 months. And basically, of course, at the beginning, everybody, and I was thinking as well that everybody said that I'm crazy, this is not art, you isolate yourself, then we are all society artists because we were isolated 6 years during the war, and blah, blah, blah. And I said, okay, I will do it, and basically, it was a period in which I wanted to make, that was the formal aspect, to do photographs to each day I had this visual diary that I photographed myself in the straight military position with a tripod like this, with a camera, with a 10-second self-timer. When I went 10 steps in front, I stand in a straight military pose, and basically each photo of those 274 days is the same. Formal aspect that you can see that this kind of time passing, as you said, temporality, was the aspect that I cut my hair at the beginning of the performance, same as they cut you when you come to military. You know, this is the first body experience what actually, you know, when they cut your hair when you enter the military, like, you know, they cut your own decisions in a way, you know, like, and I wanted also to show by cutting my hair at the beginning of this performance how time is passing. When I list those 274 photos very fast in video which following documentation, you can actually see, you can jump on the last photo, you can basically see how time is passing through my own body. And by those different photos and different locations, okay, too much talking. It was important that this personal aspect of transformation and facing with the militarized society to show also, and to try to point how society needs as well to try to find strategies to transform from the militarized society in some other more humanistic statements.
Thank you. I was just queuing up the next question, so I wasn't trying to, well, a little bit. X, I have a question for you that when I read your diary, and I know I keep banging on about this diary, but it had just been digitized when I got my hands on it, and it was just really fascinating, and it was actually like reading a novel. But the very last, one of the things that I found really fascinating was the very last page. You put in a couple of articles about something that you'd written about throughout the diary, which was the inscription that was on the Steyr standard issue assault rifle that the Australian Army were using, which I thought was quite fascinating, and it was
stamped into the receiver.
Yeah, and it is from John 8:12. It's from the Bible, and it says, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life." And you know, it sort of reminds me, I suppose, of the perverse use of Ezekiel in Pulp Fiction. You know, where it's there's something very threatening about that. And when I was thinking about this just recently, I was thinking about how you talk about that, and you use this. This is obviously not the Steyr, but that's the Steyr there. Yeah.
The army using.
And what it made me think of was just recently the horrendous attack that happened in Christchurch in New Zealand, and I've just put this image in of, you know, some of the inscriptions that were on the.
That was actually stamped in by the manufacturer.
Yeah.
It wasn't an addition by a soldier. It was when it was discovered that it was a biblical citation of you know, revenge and righteousness. It was forced to be removed.
Yeah.
And they had to remake that part. So. You know, this is the Christian right operating out of Austria, where the Steyr was manufactured. So, you know, I think that was a very telling moment for the Australian Army to be carrying a weapon that has a Christian light of the world premise.
And in fact, if it's the same factory, there was a factory in Steyr, which was the Steyr David Push factory, that made an enormous amount of carbines, Mausers in the Second World War, that used Mauthausen concentration camp slave labour.
Yes, I've discussed manufacturing for war and science for war on many occasions with my work. I think science in the service of war, if you were to look at Boston Dynamics currently, at MIT, virtually working entirely for the American military now. So this is a brains trust in service to war and, you know, mass death. I think it's a major issue that obviously it's always happened. You know, as long as there's been a war, there have been profiteers. So this is part of my broader discussions over the last 30 years of the various profiteers that operate within these theatres. And I must add as well at this point that I think this is a powerful discourse on gender war. That this war is a male premise. Now, I have spoken about this in the past, particularly at Queensland University, where almost every man in that audience walked out when I raised this issue. So, as a woman working within, a critique, it's actually very difficult to operate because the discourses are primarily male.
Although I was about to say that is Queensland.
It is Queensland.
Sorry.
It is Australia for you.
Yeah. We recently had a very bad election result in Australia, thanks to Queensland. Anyway, David, just to kind of carry on from that point, because the work that you did, like I said, was for the Wellcome Institute, and you're dealing there specifically, I suppose, with the other end of that technology, which is the technology that is the medical technology in the field. Tell me a little bit about that in terms of your experience in Afghanistan.
I mean, it was I never really had much contact with civilian healthcare, so I knew it was going to be a bit strange for me. There were 2 operating bays for the whole of Helmand province at the time. 2007, they thought the war had tailed off, but it was getting busy again, so they had a tented hospital as the conduit for every injury from all the forward operating bases. What I saw was mainly kind of civilian doctors that had volunteered to temporarily join up through territorial army or other reserve forces to get out there, and they had various reasons for doing it. Sometimes I think they just had a bit of a fetish for uniforms and liked the fact that they became automatically a colonel by taking a military rank that equated to their consultant status in the hospital. But some were desperate to be there for humanitarian reasons, and at that point Red Cross and Médecins Sans Frontières weren't active in the region they were working in, and one of the only ways to deliver healthcare was by joining up with the military. And they did it on the idea, the basis that the Hippocratic Oath wouldn't be compromised, that they would still treat everybody equally. What I saw was fragmented. Initially I really just saw the helicopters bringing people to us. We were in a very safe place in Camp Bastion, and so we weren't really sure where they were coming from. Most of the doctors would never get out to find out what had caused the injuries. I mean, they could tell what weapons had caused them, but they couldn't tell anything about the morality or the narrative that was a symptom of. I saw accelerated life-saving techniques. The progression to try and deal with catastrophic blood loss was something that was really kind of advanced heavily in Afghanistan by the British Army. But it was known already, but it was just, it's very similar to having 7 major car crashes a day, but in a tent. But they were simply working out how to bring the healthcare closer to the incident, which you can't do in civilian life because you don't expect people to suddenly have catastrophic injuries. They had consultants that all of us were trained in how to apply tourniquets to ourselves, how to kind of keep ourselves alive long enough for the consultant doctor to arrive in the helicopter and drag us back to a hospital where you'd be treated in that first hour. And they had a lot of unexpected survivals. So that means the people that in previous wars would have died survived, but often with life-changing injuries and kind of injuries which for a 19 or 20-year-old they would carry for the rest of their lives if they did survive. I saw people being very proud of that, and I was in awe of the ability for these people to function on 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, and then 12 hours on call. And they've talked about the advances that war causes in medical technology, but of course nobody really looks at angina, or nobody looks at cancer care, nobody looks at dementia in conflict. What they're looking at is how to kind of stop the blood draining away from a leg wound faster, and so they become very good at that, but it's sacrificing other forms of research and knowledge. And I don't think the net result is more knowledge. I think it's just simply a focusing of knowledge on one kind of trauma rather than another. What was interesting, I suppose, was that we were seeing this technology being lauded in terms of that survival of the golden hour, of keeping somebody alive and then sending them back to Birmingham or wherever they were going, where they would then have further operations and begin the process of living the rest of their lives. But none of us were going to be in a privileged position to find out what happened 10 years later, or whether that person could cope with this new identity of losing a limb, or becoming, having a brain injury or something else. And I think for many of the doctors that I stayed in touch with and the nurses that were propping me up and kind of, I guess, the amateur in the room trying to make sure that I didn't kind of faint or kind of embarrass myself. 10 years later, you're seeing them and the toll on them has been extraordinary. So some of them feel very proud of what they did, and they kind of go back as an elite trauma surgeon, having had this kind of extraordinary kind of period of time when they're dealing with more trauma injuries than you could deal with in 6 months in Newcastle General, in 6 weeks in Helmond. But others, because of the fragmentation of the narrative, not being able to connect the operation they conducted with the event that happened beforehand, which may or may not have been morally defensible, and with the life beyond, which may or may not have been something which was sustainable for the individual. It meant there's been this kind of unresolved anxiety and strain, which has meant that a lot of the questions which people might be able to understand through a normal context where you could iteratively begin to piece in the gaps in that story can't be addressed. So I've seen doctors that have suffered through a whole range of the kind of issues that you might associate with infantry soldiers with PTSD. Even these hugely capable people that, despite the technological advances and the statistical benefits for the MOD, have possibly left a toll which isn't being measured yet, or isn't feature on those.
And you did actually do work that then followed. You did work that then followed up from the field injuries, didn't you?
Yeah.
And was that? Did you feel like there was an ethical imperative to? This is a closed question, but did you feel like there was an ethical imperative then to continue?
It wasn't part of the artwork, it was part of the personal kind of guilt really of being there. So being a witness to somebody else being, having a life-changing injury and not really having any ability to help or to stop the action or to, kind of actually avoid the, kind of have any agency in reducing the conflict. I had some trouble resolving that. So I'd made a point of trying to track down everybody that I'd met and find them in Selyoke, Headley Court, back in their barracks, various others, and made contact with all of them to ask if they wanted the images destroyed, anonymised, or kept. And that was partly just a purely an ethical thing. I'm kind of half mad at the end of it to come back and think, oh, I've got all these consent forms, but they've all signed them after taking morphine. I don't quite trust that, And you're not sure what you do with a hard drive full of images of kind of horror, really. And so it took a long time. It took 9 months to get permission from each doctor, each parent, each from the MOD to find these people. But what was interesting was because it took so long, almost all the soldiers asked the images to be kept. They wanted a copy, and they wanted them to exist in the archive somewhere, an archive. Because after 9 months, the sense of fear of being vulnerable with an image had been supplanted with the fear of being anonymised, and for all of that narrative to have been forgotten by the world. There was also the issue that for them, the images that I took here are things which they would never have seen, because they self-anaesthetise at the point of injury, or somebody else will do it to them. They're delirious when they come into hospital, they're asleep for 5 days while they're being stabilised for being taken home, and then they wake up in Birmingham. So for them, there's a gap in narrative between probably being kind of conditioned in a cultural bubble, fittest they've ever been, through to being somebody who is then back in civilian life without any cultural references. And so, I spent time on a kind of personal mission. It wasn't part of the Welcome Trust brief, and it was just something which was probably a catharsis for myself, and kind of trying to also feel that I had a purpose in the whole process.
Now, I'd like to open up the floor for questions. We've got 25 minutes left of this session, so do we have any questions? It's that awkward moment. Yes?
One of the things I found interested in all of you and in everything that the three of you have said is you haven't, it sounds like to me, the element of representing now has actually passed, because the work that you've done is actually retrospective. It's interesting, the example from the Yugoslav wars was after the event. Does that mean, could one infer that the image, it cannot present now? And I have in my head, which might be a slightly obscure example, is read the Spike Milligan War Diaries, which are written, they're written from a diary, and you talked about diaries as well. And is the image, can the image present now, or is now better presented by the word?
That's a good question. Does anyone want to take that?
Is now a little bit like fashion, is that it's already gone as soon as it's nominated. I don't think it's possible to represent now.
I think maybe more important, instead of being now that's important, is it possible to empathise with the experience that you're seeing represented? And the problem is with these kind of pictures, it's so exoticised, it's so foreign to most of our lives, certainly, that
I'm seeing it as an illustration of someone else's life rather than my own. Even if it was yesterday, I still wouldn't really picture myself there, but I might try and emotionally understand what it might feel like to be there. But I don't have any memory of lived experience that would help fill in the gaps. And I think most of the time photographs work as a trigger to associated memories which allow you to either you deal with it purely on the formal qualities of the image, or you treat it as a representation of a world beyond. But if you're trying to generate empathy, then that's normally triggered, I think, by something in the image being reinforced by some understanding. Maybe some understanding of what pain feels like, or some understanding of what it feels like to be humbled by a landscape, or to be feeling mortal in a condition. The problem with war photography, and this was a real problem for me, because before I got out there I'd seen a lot of good war photography, and it absolutely did nothing to emotionally prepare me for the experience of standing in a war zone. It wasn't more scary, it wasn't like it wasn't a particularly active war zone, nobody was firing at me or anything like that. But I wasn't prepared for the emotional strain of seeing the absolute pointlessness of the experience, or of kind of the complete lack of information about whether it had any meaning, or whether it was criminal, what was happening beyond the horizon. We didn't have the strategic view of trying to afford news. And so the images to show me what war might look like, and actually when I was out there, it looked really similar to the pictures I'd seen. But it didn't give me any information really about what it meant. And so I think the problem it may be that sometimes images provide a really important role. So I think Simon's images that I've seen, some of them have been existed, some of the exhibitions with him, some of those actually made a really visceral connection to a place which was very important. It kind of challenged people's understandings of that place. Some of my photographs were of things which journalists weren't allowed to photograph, and so it was a gap in the record. And so that was important to me. But really, the thing we talked about earlier about the museum and the gallery, what's it for? I think it is possible to not just think, okay, words, images. We can also think about how do we spatially construct something which allows for a meaningful, empathetic engagement between, somebody who's the audience, somebody who's the reader, the watcher, the participant, and the artist and the artist's work. And it doesn't always have to be a binary between images and words. I think it can also be something like Mladen's work, which is installation-based and performative, which is particularly challenging your sense of where the artwork ends and where the safe space begins. And that can potentially be a way of dislodging that sense of a barrier between the surface of the image and somebody else's world, and cause some kind of ability to transmit something of the sense of what it means, or what it feels like to be part of that.
Can I come up with a supplementary, which is a bit cheeky?
Sure.
Given what you said, did you take any pictures of yourself?
Me?
Yeah.
But one picture that was taken by a major, I think he just insisted that there was a picture, and there was another one one picture I took in Sangin when I was just trying to see how much I'd aged. But I took 1,000 pictures, and I don't take photographs really. I'm an installation artist and filmmaker. The work I showed in the Wellcome Trust wasn't these images. It was spatial installations which were based on trying to deal with the fact that the photograph for me couldn't represent what I could see. But no, the camera was being held like that, so that people didn't know how foolish my expression might be, or how little I understood, and it allowed me to potentially formalise my understanding of watching other people suffering through the lens, so that I could defer my judgment and my empathetic engagement with it to a later point. It was a very practical device. The other thing is that people freak out if you just stare at them all the time. And it's really nice. Everybody in the war zone has a role, either to save lives or to take lives or to carry equipment to help one of those two processes. An artist doesn't really have a role, but most of the time they had no idea why I was there. And so carrying a camera made it a little bit simpler for them, because they could label me, okay, whatever they are, they're taking photographs, that's their job. And so the camera was really as a barrier, a protective thing.
You had some problems with cameras.
Yes, I had censorship issues with the Australian Army and the Australian Federal Police. I had no idea how many images they censored, that they deleted actually. So 100, maybe more images were taken before I even had time to examine them myself.
Yeah.
So we had to be examined. We were highly mediated. We were to be accompanied at all times by armed patrols. We were not allowed to go anywhere without, 24 to 48 hours notice of where we wanted to go. It was I think a situation which I've heard through other artists who've participated in this program is that you are utterly mediated by the powers that are controlling you. So in the process of losing those images, I have no idea what was even on there. Because with digital photography, you're just shooting out and hopefully making something of that when you get home to process the work.
And it wasn't simply a matter of you've taken a photograph of something that might be strategically important. There was a lot of more petty kind of
absolutely.
censorship happening.
I apparently took a photograph. The compound for the AFP and the Australian Army was a former luxury resort where there was a lot of interaction between the police and the army, and the army tended to be quite disciplined because they were dry, whereas the police were heavy drinkers. There was a lot of sexual integration going on, and I apparently shot an image of somebody doing something which I didn't even notice before dinner. I did have full access to that particular camp to photograph, other than what's called capacity, which is how many weapons they may have on the site, or satellite communications, for instance. But other than that, I was given carte blanche to the entire camp. It was quite large. I think there were about 3,500 people there. And so apparently I had photographed a tryst which was beginning, and with tactical police and another individual from the AFP. So I think in order for that person, that was a dog whistle. And so from that point on, I would have to present all my images every afternoon as we returned from a patrol or from a community visit or whatever. And they would just be deleting. I had no idea what they were deleting. So it was actually, I did put in a formal complaint to what we call Joint Operations Control. Again, highly mediated institutions, both Army and police.
It's definitely here artists are put in a very difficult position with a very restricted area of maneuver in a way. So what I'm afraid here that we have with art and in war and artists following the conflict in a war, it's like it's a little bit from the side of the, let's say, those empowered deciding to do that kind of program. It's like a little bit also maybe fetishize the war itself and using art as an accessory to the war. There we come to these problems like you were talking, that there is some decisions that you would make as artist in this certain situation, like you would really want to decide, but you were restricted in a way or censored in a way that you couldn't do it like that. So the whole system and the setup of that became questionable in a way. But I need to say that it's a very interesting experience because it was not so often, and the question is also, what is the difference between propaganda artist and war artist? Okay, propaganda artist is showing, the fight for a freedom, and things like that. The war artist is more subjective, as you are, making its own perspective on it and trying to capture the moments or make a reflection directly involved in the conflict, what we don't have so much today. Today, most of the conflict war art is based on the reenactment of the archive research and then recreation, starting from my personal the problems what we faced then are these ethical questions when the art became exploitation of the social pathetics of the conflict. And where are those borders basically when we are not exploiting and when we are actually contributing to the human aspect of understanding of the conflict and the problem itself incorporated into the conflict.
Are you okay if we go on this tangent?
Yes.
Yeah. Because I mean, the idea of complicity is really important. I think that the important thing is to acknowledge the frame and to make sure, you know, when, I don't know if this is a global thing or just a BBC thing, but when the BBC was reporting when the shock and awe tactics were happening, Gulf War II, you know, that all the journalists were required to say that we're in, you know, if they're reporting from Iraq or from a neighbouring country, we're reporting under reporting restrictions, and that there are limits to what we can say and where we can go. The funny thing is that when they're embedded within the military, they signed something called the Red Book, which was a whole series of, you know, kind of delegated powers for editorial control through the Ministry of Defence and that kind of thing, and they weren't required to say we are operating under reporting restrictions. So in a way there was a dishonesty suggesting that it was an objective perspective that could be had while with the British, you know, kind of like controlled environment rather than the foreign controlled environment. And that's deeply problematic. I think for the artist, the important thing is to recognise the limits of your view, the compromise that you're embracing, and maybe that becomes the subject of what you're working about. I mean, the levels of censorship are variable. With my case, we were fortunate we managed to negotiate just before we went out. The standard clause to do with their duty of care and that kind of thing was said no photographs of special forces, any kind of advanced weaponry, or British military or wounded. You could take photographs of Afghan wounded, but you couldn't take photographs of British. And at that point, we just looked through it. And also, that they would have, the Ministry of Defence would have copyright over the images and editorial control. So we just crossed out those lines, saying this is the Wellcome Trust. It's a medical charity. If we can't take photographs and can't document, be present for, you know, kind of medical procedures, then it's pointless. And we didn't want them to have control over the ethics. What we agreed was that they would see the images just prior to the exhibition opening, but there was nothing they could do about it. Just so they had a bit of warning so they could begin to get their story straight for how they're going to respond to these things. It made it a very kind of interesting, ambiguous relationship in the field. The other question you mentioned there was more about the war artists and propaganda artists thing, and I think that's really interesting because I'm sure people in this room probably know a lot more than me about this, but when I came back, I went to the Imperial War Museum and read up a little bit on the early war artist program here. And of course the ones from the First World War and I think the Second World War, it was under the Ministry of Propaganda. They were employed by the government. It was called the Ministry of Propaganda, and the reason why the Imperial War Museum in Britain has such an amazing archive is because they owned everything the artists did, their diaries, their letters, their paintings. But of course it didn't, you know, so in that case the war artist role was something which was entirely part of the war effort. By the time I was involved, there'd been a new precedent set by Angela Waite and other people since the Falklands conflict. We're trying to make it an independent critical voice. But it's the same term, war artist, so it's a very ambiguous role. And the regimental war artists that create the history which suits the regiment about their linear history of triumphs is also called a war artist. And so it's a complex, problematic title. And I think it's one that we use in contexts like this, but outside we'd probably call ourselves artists rather than war artists.
In the Australian context, the war, anyone who is travelling with the army becomes part of the army. So you do an induction with the army in the barracks in Sydney. You sign up to the Geneva Convention, so you get given an honorary title, you're generally lieutenant, and you are then subject to all of the rules of the army. So you're not actually independent whatsoever. This is not an independent premise of like you had George Gitto speaking in Sydney, is that he travels alone, he travels without an institution behind him, so he's not bound by any of those cultural restrictions. But every artist travelling through the Australian War Memorial is bound by very specific rules of engagement, of the Australian Army will examine everything you do. I was, I think, the last artist to have to hand over copyright in our program.
I mean, the problem is, of course, is that, I mean, Steve McQueen, who went out before me to Iraq, he was much more controlled than I was, and I think possibly Wellcome Trust learned from that in order to try to establish a bit more independence. But even then, he's still completely contained in a claustrophobic bubble of a single binary perspective out at the world from within the military, rather than looking back at yourself. I asked if it was possible to leave the military at Kabul and actually kind of spend some time with an NGO afterwards, and they said, no, the only way we can do it is if we take you from Rise Norton back out to Afghanistan and back again. And there was never a stamp on my passport saying I'd left the country. I hadn't, I'd simply entered the British military like you might do at a base over here. We had the same kind of training and that kind of thing. But the interesting thing is that you can go back as a tourist. I got tourist visa 134 and went back to Kabul and travelled on a domestic flight where they served tea instead of doing a tactical descent about 4 months later. And you can see an entirely different perspective looking back at the military and looking at how strange they look from the ground level, still with a perspective which is compromised as an outsider, but different from the one you had before. The problem is, if you only see it from outside the military, you've got no understanding of the cultural strangeness of the context which allows for people to feel any form of moral certainty engaged in institutional violence. And so the question is, how much is it worth, kind of dealing with that possible risk to your credibility and compromise in order to try and understand the bizarre culture which is so much part of British history as well as yours. It's absolutely built into the narrative. And outside, it's just mystifying. You think, how can people separate themselves from morality that operates entirely in the civilian world where violence is abhorrent through to a position where violence is defensible and moral? And I think it is necessary to have some people going in there. Just the question is whether it damages them and their integrity in the process.